to this week's webinar. We're certainly glad to have you and hoping that you're enjoying our summer and spring webinar series. Today we're talking about Manure Happens, Manure Management and Composting, and our presenter today is Shannon Stevens. My name is Marjorie Gowett and I'm the Equine Studies Online Program Manager, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I'm joined by my Open Ed colleague, Alex Ricci, who will also be providing some support. A few things we'd like you to know before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and distributed next week to our email list. You'll also find the recording on our webinar registration page. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, you'll also find them posted on that page. We've had almost 200 registrations today, and we've started the webinar with everyone's camera and audio turned off. We'll answer any of your questions through the chat, so please post any of your thoughts and your questions. You're encouraged to ask them throughout the webinar. I'll monitor the chat and I'll pose your questions to our presenter, Shannon, as we go along or when there's an opportunity that presents itself. This webinar is presented by the Equine Studies Online Program at the University of Guelph in Guelph, Ontario, home of the Ontario Veterinary College, and supported and delivered by Equine Guelph and Open Learning and Educational Support. The Equine Studies program offers 21 online equine science and business courses for the horse owner and enthusiast. Our webinar series is highlighting some of the topics and our amazing guest speakers and instructors who facilitate our courses. Today, we'll explore manure. Yes, manure happens, and as horse owners, you know it happens a lot, about 9 tons per horse per year. In this webinar, we'll discuss how to turn waste into rich, fertile compost, as well as some other manure management practices that will protect your drinking water, rivers, lakes, and the land you love. Let me introduce Shannon. Shannon Stevens has over 25 years experience with environmental stewardship, ecological restoration of wetland, prairie, and woodland. With the Wasaga Valley Conservation Authority, Shannon coordinates water quality enhancement projects, drinking water source protection projects, and habitat restoration and fish community monitoring projects. She consults with farmers, horse and hobby, farm owners, rural residents, and businesses to complete these projects. Shannon is also a guest speaker in our Management of the Equine Environment course. So with that, I welcome Shannon. Shannon, I turn the session over to you.
Oh, thanks, Marjorie, for that lovely welcome. I'm so happy to be here, and please do take advantage of the chat function. Ask your questions. In the end, this is for you. So really want to make sure people go home with their questions around manure composting, particularly answered. Love to start the day. This is my second webinar, so bear with me. But love to start today getting a feeling for what the audience is like. And if you'll see a poll's popped up, if you can let me know whether you own a farm or you're renting it or you're boarding your horses, it gives me kind of an idea of how to focus the presentation, of whether you have all the decision-making things on your own farm or whether you have to convince other people that might be owning it. All right, so it looks like actually most of the people so far have they actually board their horses, and about a third either own or rent the farm. So I'll have a very balanced presentation then. So hopefully if you're boarding, you can maybe influence the owners to do some good environmental practices as well. All right, thanks for sharing all that. All right, we'll get started then. And Marjorie will pop up if you have a question, because I can't see your chats, but she'll let me know.
That's right, Shannon. I'll monitor the chat and I will jump in when necessary.
All right. So first thing, if you've got horses, as I said, this is not news to you that a lot of manure is happening. I'm sure all of you have an intimate relationship with a pitchfork and cleaning out the stalls and all these things. And first of all, you may notice that the picture on the front here, you're like, those are not horses. And congrats, you're probably in the right seminar if you recognize straight off. But I do a lot of work with farmers and other livestock operators as well. So first, like to talk just a little bit about the basics. So if you've got an average size horse, you're looking at about 9 tons of manure a year, and you're going to add into that about 4 tons of bedding on average. And that's a lot of waste to consider. Like, this is not a small amount. In fact, in the Nottawasaga, where I work, of our 58,000 horses we estimate that live in the valley, that manure and bedding generates enough to fill about 226 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So even though you may only have a horse or two, cumulatively altogether, it does make a huge difference how you manage it. And you want to, it's a complicated question, so we'll break it down into 3 phases. 1, there's the collection. 2, there's the storage, and at that phase, composting can happen as well. And then the application to your land or to other lands and gardens that might be able to use it. Oh, bear with me. All right. So why compost? There are a lot of reasons why you might. The first is it's a very good fertilizer. It's biologically stable, has a much lower sort of bacteria counts, and the nitrogen in it doesn't tend to be as an ammonia rich as fresh manure would be. And a lot of horse owners that I've chatted with in the past actually have, it's a never-ending cost for them. They've got a manure broker that they pay to come and pick it up. And by learning how to compost and manage your own manure, this turns a never-ending cost and potentially a health and environmental risk into a nice benefit. Some of the other benefits are if you are applying it onto your own fields or cropland, composting reduces the weed seeds, reduces the parasite load, very important if you're pasturing your horses on lands that you've applied the manure, composted manure to. Also, just nuisance factor, reduces fly larvae, as well as unpleasant odors that might otherwise come from the pile. One of the secondary benefits is as the pile breaks down, it shrinks. The bacteria and stuff gobble it up, and a lot of it actually turns into carbon dioxide. So you'll actually get almost sometimes a 50% reduction in volume over the time of full composting. So basic composting, if you haven't done it before, either with manure or other ways, it's simple. You've got your raw materials, you put them into a pile, and they can be anything from manure to veggie and garden scraps, things like that. Within that, there is a whole bunch of microorganisms just chomping at the bit to get into degrading that pile. You pile it all together, you add some water, let some oxygen get at it, that's very important. And over about a period in an active pile of 2 to 3 months, you'll get the pile will warm up. All the lovely mesophile and thermophile bacteria that just love the heat and generate their own heat will create that. And you'll see the piles steaming, particularly if you're composting in winter and when you turn them. And over time, again, in an active pile, about 2 to 3 months, you'll get a beautiful, rich, it's almost like somewhere between like 75% true cocoa and coffee grounds, nice pile that's rich in minerals and nutrients. And you can use that, of course, as a soil amendment. So very basic, you take the materials on hand, give it a little bit of special treatment to make the process go well and get this wonderful outcome at the end. This is a great slide that Sprouting Farm put together that kind of gives a bit of a mnemonic to it. So you've got the compost. These are the things to keep in mind. You got to get the mix of carbon to nitrogen down. Works best around the 30-to-1 range. Now, if you think of carbon-rich sources, they're going to be things like bedding, like dried straw or wood shavings or chips or things like that. If you are adding wood ash from any fireplaces, those are also very carbon rich. Whereas the nitrogen rich sources tend to be the greener ones. So think like lawn clippings, vegetable scraps. The manure is great. And the wonderful thing about horse manure is pure horse manure is about 30-to-1 naturally. So it does make a great compost because of this. Manures that, like say chicken manure, tends to be richer in the nitrogen side. Next thing it needs, of course, is oxygen. Talked about that a little bit. We want the aerobic bacteria, those bacteria that go really well when they've got a nice rich oxygen environment. If you start getting the anaerobic, or bacteria that can live without oxygen, they're the ones that tend to make the rotten egg smells, all those sulfides, hydrogen sulfides. So we don't want that to happen. It should smell good. Moisture, you were looking for about throughout the pile, something like not soggy, but a damp, wrung out sponge is kind of this. And the pile can get quite dry because it's heating up. But at the same thing, you don't necessarily want to leave it completely open on top because it can get too wet, can leach all of those nutrients and bacteria into the ground. Particle size, a bit of a mix is great. Odor, again, we talked about a little bit before. So a good pile should smell kind of earthy and not really bad. If it's smelling bad, we'll get to the troubleshooting bit. Siting is very important, whether to cover, whether to be on a pad. We'll talk about in a bit about the importance of siting in the future parts of this presentation. And temperature, and kudos to Spreading Farm, but I think they actually have moisture under here. But really what the temperature we're looking for was 55 to about 65 degrees C. So too much higher than that, you'll actually start killing off the great microbes that are doing the composting. And too much lower, you won't kill off the parasites and the weed seeds. So there's a sweet spot here. So 7 steps. We'll go through this throughout the presentation. We got a site. We've got to build the composter, and size matters, sorry. And then adding in the organics, we'll go through a little bit of that, talk about the importance of diverting clean water and covering that site, watering as needed, turning is very important, and then the application. All right, so when you think about siting, very often people are thinking about it just in terms of the farm that they're on, but we got to think a little bit more broadly. And if part of doing this is partly about reducing the environmental and health risk associated. And if you're going to manage water, which is how a lot of these things like the bacteria and the excess nutrient runoff is carried, thinking on a watershed scale is a great way to do it. And the reason it's important, and as I say, like each one of us may only have a few small parcel of land, maybe a few animals, but cumulatively it makes a huge difference to the health of both our local environment and the broader environment. So connecting horses back to all of this, we'll look at, in my watershed, the Nottawasaga, we monitor water quality throughout our streams. And just to orient you, we're kind of up near Barrie. We start about Highway 9 and we go all the way up to Georgian Bay and Collingwood. And we're about a 4,000 square kilometer watershed with about 6,000 kilometers of stream if we laid them end to end, which if you laid it end to end could get you from Vancouver to Halifax. So it's a lot of stream to cover. But in some of our watersheds, like the Innisfil Creek one, it's really not doing great. And it's mainly around agricultural runoff reasons. So there is a great opportunity here to try to get to some of these things in terms of helping protect water quality. And it's also important because although that area starts in the top of the watershed, within about 4 days, it hits Wasaga Beach, which if it's bacteria runoff that's coming off, 4 days is not actually a lot of time for bacteria to die off within a stream environment. So all of, in a normal year, all of the hundreds of thousands of people enjoying the beach and the water there could potentially be put at risk from fecal bacteria if the loads get too high. So it does the risk can extend far beyond your property lines. Things to think about. So if we look here, oh, slide's got to change. Sorry, there is a lag. So you see here, beautiful scenic horse drinking out of the stream. It looks lovely, but as they're drinking there, they're also sometimes going to the bathroom. So actually, and that poo contains a few things. So one thing it contains is phosphorus, which can cause big algae blooms. When those sink, they can cause fish kills. Within the manure, there's nitrates and nitrogen type of compounds, which in terms of drinking water, if it gets in the groundwater, that can also be unsafe, as well as the fecal bacteria load, which both has recreational potential impacts as well as unsafe drinking water. It can also make for poor horse health. Like us, horses really do better when they drink cleaner water. So some of those things you might want to consider. So think a little bit more broadly. Particularly the phosphorus runoff is one of the leading freshwater pollution issues worldwide. This is a common problem. And the reason for that is in the natural environment in most places, there's everything you need to grow algae except for phosphorus. So it's called the limiting nutrient. And 1 kilogram can grow up to half a ton of algae. So with an average horse producing about 12 kilograms a year, that's about 6 tons of algae. So a little bit of protection goes a long way in terms of water. So there are some tools out there to help you. If you haven't done it already, the Horse Owner Stewardship Guide, which I'm sure Equine Guelph has, but we also have it on the MBCA's website. Great walkthrough of like what to look for through your property in the broader context, as well as like kind of a self-guided assessment. And I find personally maps are just one of the best things to kind of give you that broader picture. So kind of going out, there's some beautiful air photos that most counties or upper tier municipalities shoot every 3 to 5 years or so. You can find some of them on our interactive maps on our website if you happen to be in our watershed, or look at different CAs or other sources, just great resources. And then map out kind of your using units, water features, sensitive features. So here's a landowner I worked with over many projects, but not too long ago. So she had a lot of things going on. She keeps a number of horses, and she had a stream and beautiful wetland through her property. Also had some floodplains. So you see the light blue area. So obviously wanted to avoid building barns or manure structures within there. And then because these were more sensitive, ended up fencing them out there. And we actually have a bit of a grant to help with livestock fencing out of sensitive areas. So you might want to contact your local CA. Even if they don't have one, they might know if there's anyone. When we were siting the manure storage, things we kept in mind was kind of, we wanted to avoid wet spots. So get a bit of a height of the land, but you want it to be nice and close to the barn to make it user friendly, and close to your sacrifice paddocks if you have them. You also want to keep them away from both your own well, which is this little blue dot, and as well as your neighbor's well. And the absolute minimum distance for this is 15 meters from drilled wells and 30 meters from dug wells. It's actually, if you've got a municipal well in the area, it's 100 meters there. And then the other thing to consider was how far were we from surface water? And so wanted to make sure that we had at least a 50-meter minimum setback from some waterways. And you don't want it to be in a ditch if you can have it kind of sheet flow over a nice vegetated filter strip like pasture or cropland, that's even better. So it has lots of time to get treated as it goes. These are some of the things to keep in mind. So want to be away from erosion areas, protect wetlands, keep that flooding risk in mind. We don't really want the floodwaters to clean out your barn or your manure storage every year. And those are some, and sensitive ecosystems. So trying to protect those beautiful natural features is a great way to kind of start to think about your farm. Again, this was one of the wells, actually an old project where we decommissioned this well because it was one they weren't using, but it was right beside a manure. It was in a paddock basically, and you can see the manure at the bottom here. But when you have old wells, it's important to decommission them because the runoff can flow right down the edge of the crock and basically get into the groundwater untreated. So again, keep in mind those well setbacks from both used and unused wells, because once it's underground, the bacteria die-off is really slow. They can survive over 2 years underground. Again, here's what some of that protecting those sensitive areas looks like. We've got some exclusion fencing from a stream here, and you can see how well that kind of bank erosion has recovered over time. And this is often one particularly important where you have a high density of manure, like the storages or the sacrificers. This was a fellow up just at the bottom of the escarpment. So he had basically a whole escarpment's load of water flowing towards the barn, as well as big barn roofs. And this is what one of his sacrifice kind of paddocks looked like, with just a mess to deal with. And so what we did was put some ease troughs, and route the water away into a non-manure rich area, as well as do some diversion berming and swales to kind of route the water away from those high risk places. And once you've got all that, kind of like this thought is like, okay, I've kind of thought about my property. Now what? So I've got a spot I can put my manure storage. I've got my paddock orientations. And again, some of this, some might be a change. If you're coming into a new farm and you're just doing the setup, it's a great opportunity. Or it might be something on the wish list to change slowly over time. But it's important because bringing that all back, once you've got the manure and a place to put it, to compost it, you got to think about it in terms of putting it back onto your pastures and nurturing either your pasture or your cropland. Because if you think of your horses out there on the pasture and they're eating all of the grass, they're also eating that nutrients. So returning the manure in a nice form, preferably compost, back to the pasture helps close that nutrient cycle. Because if what you're doing is always just taking the manure away and either giving it to another property or putting it on or selling or paying for a broker to take it away, you're always in a bit of a nutrient deficit because your horse constantly removing some from the pasture. So your pasture health can decline. So this is one of those ways to kind of restore that nutrient cycle. It's a great thing, not just in terms of environmental quality, but in terms of feeding your horses, particularly if you have easy keepers. Quality pastures are some of the best good feed ways, low cost ways to do it. And just kind of keeping that in mind is like that kind of circle of returning those things. And I apologize, I talk with my hands a lot, so hopefully I won't batter my video thing off here. Okay. However, saying this, there's a lot of different setups. And so some people have quite large pastures, and it's not practical to collect your manure from those areas. And so one of the things you can do to help with returning those nutrients in a good way is you can harrow them. And so we've got a picture of a harrow here, but I've seen things where people have put weights on a chain link fence to everything from the very snazzy ones you can buy. And basically you drag it behind an ATV or a tractor. And what this does is for all of those horse leavings, let's call them, it breaks up the clumps, helps spread them around, distributes those nutrients. kind of shares the love a little bit, but smaller chunks break up faster, which also helps keep the things like the bacteria load lower, as well as things like parasites. It's not perfect. It's not definitely not as good as composting at first, but it helps. It also helps every time the horse goes poo, a big clump lands on the soil, and it shades off and kills part of that pasture often in the short term. And anytime you have gaps in your pasture, weeds are opportunist. So if you just leave them in large clumps, then you tend to get weed seedlings coming up in those areas. And then we talked a bit about helps with the even distribution. Okay, other things you can do for pasture health. This is a little off topic, but from the composting, but is very important and will help, is if you do want to do things like rotate your pastures, that can really help with the health of the pasture. So if you break it up into small pieces and rotate them in, again, it's going to depend a bit on your layout, but you're going to graze down to about 2 inches, might be 5-6 days till it happens, and then you move them into the next one. And then you allow it to regrow to the 5 to 6 inches. And that's very important because grass and forages, if you keep it at a very short height, they will self-root prune, so that a pasture that's kept very low, like lower than 2 inches, will start to have a root system that reflects that height. Whereas if you continuously allow it to get higher, the root system correspondingly goes down deeper as well. So, which helps it regenerate the next time. So that's part of good pasture management. And the second part, which is important for both manure as well as pasture health, we're all, well, I don't know if we're all Canadian, but I'm Canadian, and we get itchy. In the spring, there's a bit of spring fever. The horses get it too, and there's an urge to get them out onto the larger pastures, probably before it's healthy for them, unfortunately. And that can damage your pasture, as well as if you've got clay in the soil, it can create a hard pan, which is very tricky for the roots to actually penetrate. So being patient until you've got that first 5-6 inches of new growth and they've dried out a bit, it's very important. In an autumn, kind of the same thing. If you are moving your horses off pasture, basically, if the growth is slowed down to the point you're not getting that 5-6 inches of new growth, that's the time to take them off if you're putting them into something like a sacrifice pasture. And this can be an area closer to the barn where you might have moved the footings, particularly around the water and the feeder, when you don't want to damage your pastures that might be in a stressed state. They're either too wet, they might be under frozen conditions. And the nice thing with this is, because the manure here is more concentrated, it's easier to collect. Often in these areas, you can make a bit of a shelter for your horses, keep them out of the wind. And then things like improved footings, often you'll do a filter fabric with some substrate of gravel or sand on top, and that can also ease the manure collection. Not required, but it does make pick up a lot easier and reduces mud issues. Okay, we're going to open the next poll. And if you can, I'm very curious of basically how many horses people have in the facility. Think the greater facility if you're boarding, and if you've got other livestock. Okay. I'll just give a little bit of time for y'all to weigh in there. Okay, so again, there we are. Vast majority, we're looking 1 to 2 horses. A few people are in the 3 to 6, and some are in the 6+. And then again, about 60% have other livestock. So that's important, and we'll get onto that of how to incorporate their manures in as well with the composting. Okay, Now, when we're thinking, okay, now you've got a site, you want your manure storage to be, collecting the manure. And for the part that you're going to collect, it's usually going to be from things like the smaller paddocks, the stalls in the barn, things like riding rings and stuff like that, and the soil bedding. One thing I will say, remember how we talked about horse manure just being just about perfect carbon nitrogen ratio? And the more bedding you add, the more you throw it off and you make it too high in the carbon side, which can slow things down. Adding in kind of the comfort rubber mats can help you reduce the amount of bedding you use, so that really what you're using it for isn't for comfort, it's mainly just to absorb some of the liquids. And that's a good thing. Both it reduces your bedding costs, but also if you are planning to compost, really does make it quite more in that beautiful, nice range of 30:1. And, oh, we may get there. There we go. Again, talked about if you've got a high density area, collecting, particularly in the off season. And again, this is partly to help protect the animal's health. Like you, they do better when drinking clean water. They also, you know, there's foot health issues and things like that if you're starting to get a lot of mud, and you got to think that mud is also ingrained with a lot of bacteria. So being good on the maintenance is lovely. Particularly pay attention to areas around feeders and water stations. Now, I'm sure everyone's used the pitchfork, but there is some equipment out there, particularly for the larger paddocks where it still might be a bit of an issue. And you can get ones that are kind of scoopers, or ones like this, which are brush sweeper type ones. There's also one bucket tines you can attach to the bucket, say on a front end loader on your tractor or small loader, and that can help you pick up, especially if you have a lot of animals. You might want to invest in something like that and spend more time with the horses and less time picking up manure. But it is for the benefit too of your horse health to make sure their housing is nice and healthy for them. So talking about manure storage, we talked about a bit about siting. And there is another poll about how are people handling their manure right now, just to give me a feel for it. So whether you're sticking it in a pile, whether you've built a proper storage, like some kind of concrete impermeable sides, whether you're composting already, or whether you're kind of direct pasture, leaving in the pasture. Okay, I'll give you just a little bit of time to look through that. All right, so as you can see, Alex is sharing that with you all now. Most people are piling it. I'm going to guess that that's maybe not happening within a designed storage. It might be on the ground somewhere. Some people have a storage. Already about 20-something% of you are composting, so that's exciting. And then some people, of course, and facilities vary. This isn't a judgment. These are just suggestions to how do you improve things little bit by little bit. So like anything I'm talking about here, it really is take what you can from it. It's not going to apply to every site, but things to handle and troubleshoot some of the problems you may have noticed yourself. Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on. Oh, there we go. Move on to the slide now. Oh, I gotta shut that down myself, I guess. All right. Now, we'll kind of move from like some of the riskier things to think about. So that field storage idea, where you're just putting it in a pile out behind the barn, just on the bare ground, is a fairly high risk scenario, particularly if your soils aren't really heavy clay just because the chance of groundwater leaching is quite high. The breakdown is very slow, and you'll lose a lot of the great nutrients by the time it actually does compost. And I've taken water quality samples from piles that were years old, and the levels of bacteria in them, fecal bacteria, were still incredibly high. So it's not a quick way to do it. So quite high risk both for groundwater and surface water runoff. One of the other things where you do put the storage is you gotta think about, is there any field tile drain underneath? Because that can be a quick route to entry to surface water. Now we get into something a bit better where we've paved up the yard and the pile is on there and it creates an impermeable surface. Makes turning the pile and things much easier. You see the steam coming off. But depending on the slope and whether there's a curb, if this has a curb, this is pretty good environmentally around the edge so that leachate can't run off. Because what you'll see in the slide down in the bottom right is this tea-colored leachate, and that just carries a whole host of potential pollutants. So again, we want to think about diverting the clean water. You want to cover, or the ability to cover it, with either a roof or tarp. If you are going to do tarp tie downs, when you're building it is the good time to put them in. Sometimes if you stick them into the concrete mold, that helps with the anchor point tie-offs. Diverting that clean water. So we're keeping this leachate down, but it still needs to be accessible to water, because if your pile gets too dry, that can slow it down. So in the summer drought season, maybe. The best practice, definitely, we're looking for an impermeable base and curb or walls. And if you're composting, you really want to go through a multi-bin storage, like a 3 in the middle here. You see this one's got 3. And the reason for that is you want to compost, put everything in the first bin and take it through the whole process of composting until basically it's ready to apply. You don't want to add new material in once you've kind of filled it up, because that contains weed seeds, parasites, all those things you're trying to use the composting to eliminate. So basically, once you fill the first one, you put it through its composting thing and then start filling the second one. And then ease of use. So we see here, this one, they just can wheelbarrow up to the back edge of it and dump it. So do consider, you don't want this to be far off in the back 40, because you got to get your manure to it every day. If you're one of the large owners and you're building one of these things and you have more than 6 average size horses, more than 6 nutrient management units, and you're in Ontario, you're going to trigger the Nutrient Management Act, which basically means there's a bit of paperwork to do to make sure that the storage is properly sized and that you've got a plan for how to apply it so you won't have an environmental impact. Very important, we had a whole bunch of groundwater sources across Ontario that were basically getting way too high in nitrate, which can cause blue baby syndrome, which is a big health problem. So the nutrient management came in to help address that. And it helps you, one of the things is making sure you've got at least 240 days of storage. I will say every farmer I've ever worked on a manure storage with has regretted if they went to the minimum. They've all said I should have done a full year. And that way, if you get a wet fall or an early wet spring and you can't get it on without damaging your pastures, then it gives you some extra leeway time. Now this might be a bit bigger. Most of you guys were in the 1 to 2 horse range, but there are smaller options for this as well. And if you've got, in that range of 1 to 4 horses, a smaller 3-bin composter might be a good way to go. And here you can see they've got the ability to cover it with tarps to keep the moisture level in that run out sponge kind of way. So just a bit of talk about manure in the law if you're in Ontario. So if you do a new barn build or expand a manure storage and then you're above that 6 nutrient management units, sorry, frog in my throat, you will probably find out when you get your building permit with the municipality that you're triggering the Nutrient Management Act, and that they'll ask for a nutrient management strategy if you're building a storage. So there are 2 ways to develop this. You can hire a nutrient management consultant that basically is trained up to a minimum provincial level, or you can take the course yourself. So both different options. And then the nutrient management plan. So if you think strategies are for storages, plans are basically for applying. And the plans tell you, okay, you can apply this much, and you're applying just the right amount that the pasture needs or the cropland needs, and that you're not applying in excess, so it's not going to impact things. Because water is actually protected, and there's both the Environmental Protection Act, and basically what they say is they don't want to see offsite impacts, and particularly around water quality objectives. So things like phosphorus or bacteria that we've talked about before. Okay, getting back, so little reminder about what we're looking for in our compost pile. You build your next, say, 3-bin covered storage. Ooh, when you're building those, one last thing to consider, or where you expect your equipment upgrade to be, because ideally turning these with a loader is a lot easier than, say, a pitchfork. So nutrient balance, we've talked a bit about that carbon-nitrogen ratio. We want that moisture content to be good. And when you're turning the pile is often the best time to water it, because the center can get quite dry sometimes. So it makes sure the moisture is nice and even, and damp sponge. And then third point, basically, it just is the oxygen part, really. A fluffy pile that's not dense and matted is going to do much better. And if you can do these things, it's going to speed up your rate of decomposition. Whereas that pile out behind the barn, again, we're digging down into this, and this was over 10 years old, this one. And we were finding in the bottom of the pile, so the oldest stuff still had really largely not decomposed, and there was like terrible rotten egg smells and things like that. So not your best soil amendment for your cropland or pasture. So that's kind of passive composting. It will eventually get there, but it's going to take a long time. Oops, bear with me. Ah, my mouse is on the fritz. Oh, okay. Okay, what we want to move to is active composting. That 3-bin style is a nice kind of source for a lot of practices. And basically you're putting it in and turning it, watering it as needed. Now, if you're really ambitious and you have more horses, you can actually go with a very active style, which involves an air blower. And this is a farm, Monty Acres and Suzanne was the one who put it together. And so she's got what looks like a normal composter, but down here, we see there's something exciting happening. There's actually a bit of a blower. And in the pits, there's some concrete wells. So this is actually sealed on the bottom. There's a bit of gravel, but underneath it, it's part of a concrete well. And the pipe comes in, and then you cover it with wood slats. And this forces air up through your pile. Now, it's important to note this was done a little while ago. The block design isn't allowed anymore. They actually require it to be concrete curb just because the leachate can get out. But still, it's a good example. This is if you're triggering the act there. So anyway, that air is coming up through the pile, which means you don't have to turn it quite as often. You do want to turn it a bit. But the best part about these things is it makes compost after about 30 days. And you can see this steaming away. You can see they put a lot of thought into making this easy to access, both from the front and the bottom. And that the equipment sizing is right. It's a fair bit bigger than the loader that they're using now. Now you saw that pile steaming, and temperature is something you actually, especially if you haven't composted much before, you want to pay a lot of attention to. And you can, for 20, 30 bucks, you can buy these soil probe temperature gauges. That's well worth it, because one, it can tell you whether you need to turn the pile. So if you chart the temperature over time, if you take it every day or two, especially at the beginning when you're learning this, chart it up. So two things are going to happen. You're either going to see it get too hot, so above 65 degrees, and at that point you want to turn it to cool it off. But the other thing is you'll see it rise and then fall as the bacteria run out of food. And then you want to turn it to make sure you have even composting. So all the edge stuff, which will be cooler than the core, gets in the middle. And that helps make sure you have even composting and that you've also killed your parasites and your weed seeds and things like that. So typically over 2 to 3 months, you might be turning it 4 to 5 times. This is why having some equipment to be able to turn the pile is actually quite handy. Now, that's probably, if you do nothing else, turning the pile is probably one of the key things. And if you have a lot of animals, I know with the cattle farmers, they'll often, sometimes on a pad or high clay soils, they'll do what's called a windrow, where they have a special equipment that turns it, and it kind of creates these long piles like you saw there. But for horses, putting it in kind of a container is nice if you're in a small number group. Now, troubleshooting, things that are very typical to find depending on how you're managing it. It's nice to have a troubleshooting guide. If it smells bad, so like rotten eggs, probable problem is not enough oxygen. So turn and fluff the pile more regularly. If it smells bad and is soggy, it's also a problem, usually with oxygen, but now it's too wet. So letting it dry out, covering it is helpful. And if the pile's dry, water it. A dry pile, it's just not going to move along through the composting as quickly. Those bacteria need a film of water to live on. Okay, so if you're finding you have very regular temperature where there's a small warm area in the middle, but not that warm, and it's having problems keeping its heat, probably your pile is too small. And this is actually one of the benefits of having a stall type composter, is it helps that pile gain the heat. So you generally want it at the very least 1 meter sort of wide, and more is better, really, to get it to be warmed up. And the other reason why it may not warm up is if you've got an awful lot of carbon in there, you will be just slowing the decomposition down. So too much carbon, bedding or wood chips, that can slow it down. So adding in rich nitrogen sources like more pure manure, grass clippings. Occasionally, people actually do fertilize their compost pile, like with an aluminum sulfate or something, like a nice nitrogen-rich one that doesn't have any of the other ones, just to get it moving again if you've gone way overboard on the carbon side. All right. So now, hopefully 2 to 3 months have gone by. You've got something that looks like beautiful, rich soil. And what are we going to do with it? So what do you do with your manure now? I'll ask you in the poll if you want to fill that out. All right, and if Alex wants to share that, that would be lovely. So we can see most people are applying it on their own farm or cropland or pasture or hay fields. Some people were paying a broker to take it away. So if you're in that area, you might want to think of maybe if you've got the land to apply it to, this might be a golden opportunity for taking some of the cost away. And some people are still figuring it out. So maybe, hopefully this will have given you some ideas. All right, so some of the things you can consider with compost application is applying it back on the pastures. And you want to do this in a nice thin manner. And ideally, remember how we talked about that nutrient management course? If you want to be very scientific, you can test the soil, get an application plan. And what I would say is there is a benefit to this, particularly if you haven't done one before, because what you typically find is the more used pastures right around the barn tend to get more love in terms of manure and compost. And so their nutrient levels are already quite high. And then the farther away you get, then that's going to be poorer soil. So want to stay away from streams and of course avoiding winter spread, which is high prone. So hope I've given you something to think about today, looking at manure not as a waste, but as an asset. And if you can incorporate some of these things, you really will turn something that really is a never-ending cost, if you're, say, paying a broker, to something that can actually both help the environment, your horse health, and the feed quality that your horses have. So thank you, and would love, haven't heard from Marjorie, so I'm guessing haven't had too many questions, but would love to ask if anyone has them.
Yes, Shannon, thank you so much. We haven't had very many questions, so you must have been very clear in your presentation. But if you do have some presentations, now's the time to ask away. I found that totally interesting, Shannon. I don't compost anything, and it's inspired me to get something happening.
Well, I'm glad. And it is actually quite exciting to watch something invisible turn that process, and you see it's so much different looking when it comes out from what it started off as. So, and it happens quite quickly if you've got a good active compost pile going.
We have a couple of questions coming in now. Kara asks, how do you tell what the oxygen content is in your pile? You mentioned 5 to 10%.
So what I would say is, this is one of the nitty-gritty details, that if you are turning your pile regularly and you're not smelling any kind of rotten egg smell, you're probably in the right zone. There are special probes and things you can do if you're like a commercial composter. But I would say for the average person, don't bother with that. But you've probably, if you've composted before, things like if you put a whole bunch of leaves in and they can get matted down, or grass clippings, those are things to be careful of if you've got uniform size, just to make sure that you're incorporating them so that's kind of mixed up and the pile's nice and fluffy.
Lisa would like to know, what is the distance that your pile should be from the barn?
This will change, but what I would say is you're cleaning up your barn basically every day. So honestly, as long as you're not close to a well or a sensitive site, making it as close and easy to get to is a good thing. You also want to make sure you check with your insurance, just to make sure that the buildings are meeting any minimum separation, as well as your municipal bylaws could have something to say. So, but I've seen them where they've been built right onto the yards, and is really great in terms of easy use.
Gail has heard of Manure tea for your garden. Can you tell us what that is and how it can be used?
So you can use, and I've seen them done more on pads, where they put a curb and then they put kind of a little drop well concrete structure to collect some of the leachate. Now you want to probably at the beginning of the compost just water that back in. It will be too high in ammonia often at the beginning. But once you have, it's either you can mix your compost in or manure in with water and then just use the water. But if you're using the slightly more composted, any kind of runoff, that can be watered on, and it's just basically a liquid fertilizer. So because some of the design is on an angle, you'll have something of a puddle, and some people have actually designed them to collect that leachate in a more organized way so they can use it.
Um, Shannon would like to know about the flooring. Is concrete best?
Concrete is probably one of the best sort of impermeable surfaces, and partly because it's easy to make into a form of what you want it to look like. Whereas if you, like, especially they used to use blocks, but then you can have the leachate run under that, which can be a problem if it gets off into the soil in the groundwater. But you can do composting on a pad. It just requires a bigger space. So if you do have walls, it lets you kind of confine everything, helps build the temperature, and reduces the footprint of your composter.
We also have a question about the daily spreading of manure on fields that aren't used or anywhere near the barn or turnout areas. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so, and there are places where I've met horse owners where they are keeping their animals out the entire year. And they're often on quite large pastures. And so in that case, you might want to do a little bit of pickup around concentrated sources like a water or a feeder. But for the rest of it, that harrowing, you're not going to collect it from large pastures. So that harrowing helps break it up. Is that answering the question? Or have I misinterpreted?
Whoever asked that question, because there's not a name attached to it, let us know if we didn't answer your question.
I'm like, I hope I got it right.
Yeah, if people are phoning in from their phones or calling in from their phones, it only says iPhone or Samsung. It doesn't tell me someone's name. So we have a few questions like that. Like this one is coming from an iPhone. Using paper pellets for bedding. It has been sitting around for a year in a small pile from 2 horses. Do you think I can put it in the pasture?
It's going to be high carbon, so it'll be slow, but if it's kind of mixed in with the urine and the manure, it will eventually break down. I would say the best thing would be to throw it into the compost pile and let it break down even further. But again, it's an organic material, so if you do pasture apply it, it will eventually break down.
Okay, our person that we answered about the
Daily
spreading
collection.
manure on the non-horse pasture. So their question was related to non-horse pastures. Stall manure is collected and spread daily.
Okay, so is that, okay, so that's, I've never heard of it being done daily. If you're putting it on, say, a hay field, I'm gonna guess that's what they mean by non-horse pasture. That's a lot of work to do.
I think what they, yeah, I think what they might mean that I'm not sure if they mean that they're putting it on before it's composted or after it's composted.
I would say whether it's raw manure or composted manure, you could do it daily if you really want to, kind of evenly distribute it. My tendency, just to make it slightly more efficient, even doing a temporary field storage, as long as it's not long term, and then when you've got enough to load your loader, spread it over evenly. There's nothing wrong with doing it every day. It's just an awful lot of work to try to evenly apply it throughout the hay field if you're doing it daily. Again, if you just like to, go for it. It's not going to do anything bad, but it's if you wanted to create a small temporary field storage to collect up enough to make it worth your while.
Rebecca has been told that wood chips aren't great for spreading on hay fields, but once it's broken down to compost, is it okay?
Absolutely, and that's, again, one of those really carbon-rich kind of sources, and it's also a fairly big chunk of material. So it's a slower breakdown product. If you did put it on a pasture, it would be in the pasture for quite a while because it is, again, big, slower decomposing material. But if you add it into the composter, it would break down significantly faster.
So we have time for one last question, Shannon. I lost it here. Just a second. Where was I?
You're doing great. I can't see these at all.
Oh, yeah. Cindy would like to know if there's an alternative to concrete floor for the 3-bin system.
If you have, my favorite is definitely the concrete, but if you have a very high clay, that can also be an option because it would really slow down that leaching. And OMAFRA, Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food, actually talks about the amount of clay content you need to have for that to help prevent leaching into groundwater. What I will say though about those, back in some of my old research, you will still get leaching through the clay. It's a lot slower, but it does happen, and those plumes can last a long time. So an impermeable thing like concrete, it's more expensive. Probably, it's definitely better than bare soil, and then clay is somewhere in the middle.
Well, Shannon, I would like to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. A number of our participants have thanked you and let us know how informative your talk was. So I think we've maybe inspired a few people to start composting.
Oh, well, that would be very exciting. Well, thank everybody. Thank you everyone for joining me. And it's nice to know that it was received well.
For those of you still on the line, you will get a email sometime next week with the link to the webinar if you wanted to watch it again. Shannon has shared her email address. If you think of any more questions, I'm sure she would be happy to further answer them. And with that, I say good afternoon, and we'll see you next time.